Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to joint webinar from CSAC and Cal Cities on the 2020 update of our statewide local streets and roads needs assessment. My name is Chris Lee. I'm a legislative representative for housing, land use, and transportation for CSAC. And so I'm going to do a few logistical points, a little bit of history about the needs assessment, and then introduce our next speaker. So we've been doing the needs assessment every 2 years since 2008. It's proven to be a very effective tool in advocating for a fair share of transportation resources for local streets and roads needs, most notably in 2017 with the passage of SB1. And so this version of the report, we're looking at the impacts of SB1 and ongoing needs for local transportation agencies. We've left about 20 minutes at the end of this webinar for Q&A purposes. Next, I'll turn it over to my colleague from the League of California Cities.
Hello, I'm Damon Conklin with the League of California Cities, and really excited and pleased to share with everyone this report. This report represents really input from California's 58 counties and 482 cities that own and maintain over 144,000 centerline miles of local streets and roads. And it is an impressive 85% of the state's total publicly maintained centerline miles. Cities and counties have already completed thousands of maintenance and rehabilitation and safety and active transportation projects through all the communities throughout the state using SB1 dollars. And this report is the first real analysis to analyze the impacts of SB1 on local roads. In reflecting an impressive 99% of the total centerline miles of this local streets and roads throughout our state. In addition, this report is one of the first to closely examine local bridges, which are an integral part of our transportational infrastructure. And the report shows over 12,000 local bridges that are aging and in critical need of maintenance and infrastructural support. In addition, the goal of this report is to educate public policy and decision makers at all levels of government about the infrastructural investments needed to provide California with a seamless, safe, and efficient multimodal transportation system. It presents future funding requirements for California's local streets and roads and bridges. And we know from previous reports that transportation investments have a 4-to-1 economic multiplier that reaches the benefits of virtually every aspect of our economy. This report can be used to evaluate choices and to develop comprehensive solutions to address our critical infrastructural needs. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Margot, President of NCE and the project manager of this report.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you, Chris. So let me dive right into it. So just to, first of all, before we go in, I want to give a quick shout out and thank you to our project sponsors. These are folks that have been with us through thick and thin and have funded the project, and they also ask all of you in the audience or your staff to help us provide us with data for this project. So the California State Association of Counties, the League, the County Engineers Association of California, the RTPAs, the Rural Counties Task Force, and then for the first time this year of the cycle, the Caltrans HBP program advisory committee also contributed financially to help us highlight some of the impacts on our local bridges. So a big thank you to everyone. And I wanted to start out first with just talking a little bit about, has this project been successful? Because we've been doing it now for 14 some years, about 12, 13 years. And the question is, that's a long time, a lot of data we've gathered, a lot of money we've spent. And I think if we were to count, were we successful in trying to get more money? And the answer is, I think, unreservedly, yes. SB1 was the first influx of transportation money in over a decade, and local agencies got $15 billion over 10 years just for local streets and roads and bridges. So I think in my mind, it has been successful, but it's not the end. We knew when SB1 passed that it wasn't going to be sufficient, but it did address some of the deficiencies, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. So just to kind of maybe recap a little bit about what Damon said. You know, when we started this project back in 2008, we had fairly simple objectives. We just wanted to know what were the conditions like statewide. If we were to aggregate all 539 cities and counties, you know, what was that number going to look like? What was it going to cost, you know, to maintain these roads and the bridges? And then let's not forget, it's not just roads and bridges. It's also your traffic signals, it's your sidewalks, it's your bike and pedestrian trails, all of these, and the safety component. These were things that that's part of the local infrastructure. How much money do we need, and how do we advocate that and communicate that information to the state legislature? So we've tried to do all of these things every 2 years, and we'll continue to do so. One of the things I like to do when we start out is, with this presentation, is I like to share is that people don't understand or don't really realize how big the local streets and roads infrastructure is in California. It's about 85% of the roads. If you look at this pie chart here, the green and the blue, that's, you know, a large chunk. We think of state highways as the carries a lot of the traffic, and it does. But in terms of miles, it's actually not a huge number. So when I give this presentation to perhaps the more of the layman, I usually start out by saying that, you know, in the morning when you open your front door, the first thing you're going to do, whether you bike to work, walk to work, take the bus, drive, you're going to be on a local facility. And that's really important. So let's talk, what we did in our study is we broke everything down into 3 components. Let's talk about the roads or the pavements first. And when we look at pavements, we needed to get really good data. And one of the sources of data we look for is, does the city or the county have a pavement management system? And California is by far ahead of the curve than most of the other states in the United States. And you can see on this pie chart, this is 98% of the total miles in the state of that 144,000 is actually monitored, inventoried in a pavement management database of some kind that's maintained by the city county. What that does is that it gives me a lot of confidence in the robustness of the data and the accuracy. Now, I get that not everyone's updating their road conditions every year, but it's fairly recent. It may be a couple of years old, and that's still good data rather than no data. So 12% though of the agencies don't have one, but these are agencies that are very, very small cities, less than 50,000 people, less than, you know, less 50 miles of roads, and they didn't add up to a whole lot. But just to give you an idea, lots of good data. So let's go then to what did we do with data on this 144,000 miles? Well, we took the information that you all provided us, and thank you too, by the way, for encouraging your staff to give us this information. We took that, we aggregated it, and then we put it on a scale of average PCI. And I think most of you are familiar with it. If not, it's a very simple scale, 0 to 100, with 100 being good or excellent, and then 0 being very poor or fail. And I have a couple of pictures here to show you what the good or the bad road looks like. And you can also see that what the average PCI has been over time since 2008. And it had a pretty steady drop, you know, a couple points over the 2-year cycles that we see. But you see, we started at 68, and in 2018, it was a tad, a little bit over 65. So where did we come to in 2020? And this is after basically 2 years of SB1. Well, you can see that in 2020, our average PCI is 66. So it went up about a point from 65 to 66. First time ever that it has gone up in the 12 years or so that we have looked at this report. In general, cities have a slightly higher average than the counties. This has been a trend that is consistent, probably not a big surprise. Most of the new roads that are built are mostly in the cities, and that does skew the average PCI upwards. Well, what does a PCI of 66 look like? Kind of sort of looks like this. And for those of you who work with roads, it's probably not a big surprise. It's not bad. There are a few cracks happening, but it's still acceptable in terms of rideability, but certainly beginning to show signs of wear and tear. And for me, you know, I can see a little bit of structural failure beginning, and that is just the it's kind of the first signal of significant cost, repair costs coming out. What does it look like statewide? Well, even though the PCI went up from 65 to 66, it's a number and it's an average, and averages don't tell the whole story. So what I wanted to share with you here is let's compare between 2018 and 2020. And what the colors represent, the red counties have a PCI of less than 50, and the blues are in between 50 and 70, and the green is in 71. And you can see that we have, a handful of red counties, three green counties in 2018. And what we have now in 2020, even though the average PCI went up to 66, you can see that the number of green counties actually dropped. So that is, when I say let's be careful with averages, this map kind of tells the whole story. Even more telling, when we look at where things were back in 2008 to 2020, 12 years ago when we started this, things were looking actually not as bad because about a third of the counties were in the green category and only a sprinkling of counties were in red. But in 2020, we've lost ground, even though the average is just point out, but a lot of agencies have lost ground. You can see that only Riverside and Orange County in Southern California, San Francisco in Northern California are in the green category, but otherwise everything is pretty solidly blue with a couple of red counties out there. So we have some work left to do. SB1 has, and I'll share again with you some more information, but we still have a ways to go. And in case you are interested in knowing what your county looks like, there are maps like this for counties in the report, in Appendix C of a final report, which you can download now. And I'll share the link with you at the end of this presentation. But here's Los Angeles County. The average is 68. And you can see that, we've got greens and dark blues, and we separated the blues into what we call higher risk and lower risk. But you should get these kind of maps. We have another one here, for instance, this is Sacramento County. The county is pretty red, but there are some bright spots in there. The green is Elk Grove and Folsom, and then we have a couple of blues in there as well. I also wanted to touch on complete streets because this has been a big topic of interest, not just to the public, but to our legislators and our elected officials. And the most common question I get is, how much more does it cost to do a complete street project? And I'm going to say the same thing, which I've told you in past cycles, which is it depends. There's a huge range in incremental costs. In our report, we did 4 case studies. Here's one for Santa Ana and Emeryville. And you can see in the case of Santa Ana, a medium to large size city, 400 miles of streets, so a pretty big network. And they gave us an example of a project where they included bike lanes, a landscape buffer, street lights, some sidewalk widening, and the incremental cost was actually fairly modest, about $18 a square yard on top of the paving. But then you look at Emeryville, small city, only 20 miles, and they did also some street widening, did some bike bus facilities, as well as a transit stop, and the cost is $50, an incremental $50 a square yard. So that's quite significant. Now, here's 2 other cities, another one in San Clemente, another medium-sized city with some street widening, adding class 2 bike lanes. Now the cost is quite high, $135 a square yard. And then you go to Mill Valley, a very small city in Northern California, 60 miles, and where they replaced the medians, added a bike lane, widened the sidewalk, added ramps, and the incremental cost was $700. So you can see that this incremental cost depends a little bit on the size of the agency, depends on the size of the project, and very hard to normalize and say there's one number to use for everyone. But we did make an attempt. We took all of these incremental costs that you reported to us, and on average, it's about $117 a square yard. So it's not inexpensive. It will add to your budget, and something to be aware of as you consider complete street elements. There are also additional regulatory requirements that you all reported, ADA compliance, curb ramps and such, NPDES, storm water quality issues, adding traffic signs. All of these are requirements that you need to do. It comes out of the same pot of money. And so we wanted to ask folks, well, what are the needs within your agencies to meet these requirements or this compliance? And you can see that the numbers are quite big. Now, these are responses that are usually hard to track because you don't track them separately, but they're educated estimates, and they're consistently statewide about 9.6 billion, and that's been true ever since we started collecting this data. Now, the funding, of course, is not quite 9.6 billion, and so we have a shortfall about $3 billion just on looking at these components. One thing I wanted to touch on quickly is also to look at construction costs, because this is what's going to help us in our funding analysis. And we've been tracking construction costs now since 2008. So let's look at the street with a PCI of 75, thereabouts, pretty good condition. And what we want to do is add a seal. Currently costs are about $660 a square yard. And if you look at this chart, you can see that first of all, there's a big range in seal costs to under $1 to about $10. Depending on the type of seal, and we just lumped everything into one category. But we look at the average. In the 2008 average was about $3 a square yard. It is now doubled to about $6. And there has been a little bit of a consistent upward trend. There was a flat spot right after 2012, which is after the recession ended, and it was stable for a while, but it's consistently gone up. So between 2018 to 2020, costs of seals have gone up almost 20%, quite sharp. The same thing goes for overlays. Here's a street that you would typically want to overlay, perhaps some dig outs, maybe some milling. And if you look at the trends, again, you can see that we hit a high of 2008, and then we actually dipped during the recession. If you remember, bid prices came in as much as 20% lower than the year before, and it started going up, but very slowly. And it really wasn't until the last 2 years since 2018 that it's now gone up about 15%. And for the cost right now, it's about $25 a square yard. So quite a significant increase. And then the last one I wanted to share with you is, if you had to reconstruct a street, what are those trends looking like? So it's currently around $85 a square, and this is the big change. Back in 2008, reconstruction was expensive. It was about $80. And then through a series of different methodologies, the use of full debt reclamation, more cold in place recycling, and reusing materials, we actually saw a drop in cost, and that was pretty stable over the last 10 years or so. And it's not until 2018 that we started seeing it go up now. And now for the first time, it's higher than the cost back in 2008. So this has increased about 23%. So my point is that the trends in construction costs over the last 2 years, we're seeing significant increase, 15% to 20%, and that has an impact on the monies that we have available to repair. Now, I don't want to forget about unpaved roads. There's almost 10,000 miles of unpaved roads, primarily owned by the counties, and those need funding as well to maintain. And we estimate that about $1.6 billion over the next 10 years. So when we aggregate up all the total pavement needs, it's pretty high. It's about $76 billion. And I want to note something. Back in 2018, when we added up everything, it was only about 61.7. So these costs have gone up. And I hope I've been able to share with you, the trends in construction costs. That is the single biggest factor in contributing to the increased needs. So what we did then was we looked at all of you county by county. And again, these maps are available in the final report, Appendix C, and you can pull it out. But I'll give an example. If we look at this map, what it shows is the total value of needs. The dark brown means that these are the counties that need more than $2 billion overall. And when I say the county, it includes the cities within the county as well. And the light yellow, it's less than $500 million of needs. So no surprise, I think there's a preponderance of needs in Southern California. lot more miles in there, a lot more population, networks are bigger, and you need more money. Just LA County alone needs about $12 billion. Some in the Central Valley as well as the Bay Area. Then when you look at the funding available to meet those needs, it's almost flipped though. Let's take a look. Look at the Northern California and the rural North counties, all light yellow or tan color, which shows that needs of less than $1 billion. But when you look at whether their needs were met, less than 20% of their needs are met. And yet if you look at LA, about 40% of up to 40% of the needs are met. So in the Bay Area, it's in the yellow category, between 40 to 60% of the needs are met. So what this picture shows you is, yeah, it's great to have lots of repair needs, but do I have commensurate funding to take care of it? And what this chart shows is that the rural counties are actually a lot worse off, even though their needs are smaller, their funding is disproportionately less. And so you don't have the kind of availability of funding that the urban areas do in the Bay Area and in Southern California. Orange County, I think, is the only, and San Francisco are the only two counties which show that 80% of the needs are met, at least 80%. So this is, I think, another part of the narrative that you might want to share with your elected officials. I said also that there are essential components in here. These are all the storm drains, the signals, the safety, striping, bike ped, everything else that's not just the pavements. Well, they add up. It's about 30% of the total needs. And I'm not going to bore you with the very rigorous statistical analysis we did to arrive at this number. It's all described in our final report, but I want to share with you what the results were. And if you look at a similar map, the total needs for essential components is about 35 billion. That's compared to the 70+ billion for pavements. And if you look at this map now, again, you can see very similar. Primarily the urban counties in the along the coastal areas have the highest needs. LA County, for instance, needs about 6.4 billion in needs. San Diego County, Santa Clara, but the majority of the counties in California have up to about 500 million. I also want to touch on bridges. We put a lot of effort on bridges, and this is to say thank you to Quincy Engineering and Spy Point Partners, who were our partners in working on this report and doing the analysis. And it is with the guidance of the Caltrans HBP committees, and the committee members were very vocal and helpful in helping us arrive at some of the numbers we got. So let me give you first a quick background on what California's bridges look like. There are over 12,000 local bridges. That's almost half of the entire state. Ton of bridges. This chart shows the number of bridges that are owned by every single county. And that little peak in the middle that you see there is LA County, which owns pretty much about more than 1,400 bridges. But most of you are probably in the 200 bridge range, the 200 to 400 range. The thing about the bridges is that they're old. Our bridges are really old and they're continuing to age. More than 20% of the bridges are more than 80 years old. And for those of you who are bridge engineers, the typical lifespan is either 50 to 75 years old. So we know more than 20% are already beginning to exceed their lifespan. That should be a concern, because when bridges fail, it's a pretty catastrophic failure. If a road failed and got a pothole in it, well, you can still kind of drive it. But if a bridge is deemed unsafe or failed, you can't. And if for rural communities, particular, they're kind of the lifeline, right? You could have detours of up to 20 miles just to get out of particular areas. And so this is pretty important. And we need to keep track of this. So what does it look like given the funding levels that we do have? Well, let's take a look. Right now, if we were to look at bridge conditions, the pie chart on the left-hand side says that about half the bridges in local bridges are in good condition, about 40% are fair, and 11% is poor. And when you compare that with the state bridges, that's the pie chart on the right-hand side, the picture is very different. The state bridges, 3/4 of it is in pretty good shape, 20% is fair, and only 3% is poor. So we have a long ways to go before we can even aspire to where the state bridges are. And if you look at it county by county, we have a map. And here, this is the green counties are counties where less than 4% of the bridges are in poor condition. The red counties are where more than 15% of the bridges are in poor condition. And then the yellows are kind of in between that 4 to 15%. So we've got a good, fair, poor categories. And you can see there's a lot of counties where more than 15% of the bridges are in poor condition. So big concern, and only really a handful of green counties. The rest of them are either yellow or red. And if we were to add it up, about over 4,800 of these bridges need repair or replacement. That's a big number. That's more than a third. We also, for the first time in this cycle, we will have on the website a series of, it's an interactive web map where you can click on California, click on the county, and it'll zoom all the way down to an individual bridge. And it will give you, for your agency, what the condition is of that bridge as of the last time it was surveyed. And this is based on the 2019-2020 National Highway Bridge Inventory. So that data will be available and live in probably in the next few weeks. And you'll be able to see sort of those averages for your county. We will also have a story map that talks about the importance of bridges. And that should go live on the website pretty soon within the next 30 days, I think. And that should, again, help communicate the importance of these bridges to mostly a non-technical audience, the public, or to elected officials. And hopefully, from there you can see that we've made a compelling narrative that bridges really, really needs attention. So just to kind of be consistent with the rest of the presentation, you can see that the total bridge needs, if we look up, add them all together, here you've got the blue part of the pie chart, that's bridge replacement of 2.4 billion, preservation 1.2 billion, widening 2.6 billion, scour 500 million. You add it all up, it comes up to about 7.2 billion in needs over the next right now. So the question then is, well, how much money do we have? Do we have 7.2 billion to fix everything? And the answer, of course, is unfortunately, no, we do not. But what we do have, this chart, we ran some scenarios to say, what do we need annually to kind of keep the percentage of poor bridges consistent to about 10% or thereabout, 10-15%. And we need about $800 million. In contrast, what we do have is only about $290 million. So we have a big gap between what we have and what we need. And in our report, the bridge, we will have a companion bridge report that delves into great detail. And in that report, you'll see that we talk about the historical expenditures on bridges. It has been flat for over 10 years. And I think we might be able to see some light at the end of the tunnel if the infrastructure bill is signed by President Biden in Washington. But currently, those funding levels are pretty flat. All right. So those are hopefully, a quick summary of all the different components. And the next thing we wanted to do then is we wanted to look at the future and says, what do we need? So how is SB1 helping? So let me share with you a little bit of the funding trends. You can see here that we track funds in 3 different pots. The blue is federal money, and it's pretty consistently in the 8, 9, 10% range. It never really gets very high. And so what this tells me is that for local agencies, cities and counties, we don't depend on federal money a whole lot. The green part is local money. That's your sales tax, your bond measures, your parcel tax, the remarkably creative number of funding sources in the local part. It's pretty significant. And then the red part is state, and that's primarily HUTA and gas tax. And there's a dark red and a light red. And the dark red is all the historical sources, primarily HUTA. But you can see the light red is SB1 And for the first time, SB1's adding for the pavement, just the pavement portion, about $533 million a year. That's about 22% of the total pot. So a huge influx really of money to roads. So what did SB1 do? Well, as I said earlier in the PCIs, it arrested the initial decline and raised it by about a point. But what we're sharing is that, and we knew this would happen, is that it's not going to stop it completely over the next 10 years. It has slowed the decline by about 4 points. So if you look at this chart and compare it to 2018, we're actually better off. It was, I think, average PCI of 54 in that range, and we're now at 59. So doing much better. That's the line chart that you see. The bar chart is the deferred maintenance or the unfunded backlog. It's still increasing, but a little bit more stable. And we're going from 41 billion to about 55 billion. And again, when we ran the initial analysis back in 2016 and 2018 about the impacts of SB1, we showed this line as a little bit flat. But that was, of course, assuming that construction costs would also stay flat. And as you've seen in my presentation, that is not the case. So if we wanted to maintain everything the way it is, I'm sorry, let me back up. The existing budget is about 2.43 billion a year now for roads. And if we wanted to maintain things, keep it at the status quo, we need about 3.8 billion. So that's about another $1.4 billion in addition to stabilize things. And then finally, the chart that we always like to show that people ask us is, well, if you had all the money in the world, how much do you need to fix everything over the next 10 years and then keep it stable? And the answer is we need about 7.8, 7.9 billion a year for the first 10 years. And then after that, we would only need 3 billion a year to maintain it at that level. And this is, again, I think consistent with what we've shown in the past, is that it's a lot cheaper to keep good roads in good repair once you get them good. But California is pretty much, we're in a hole and we have to dig ourselves out of that hole before we can get to that 3 billion. But it is possible to maintain our roads with the existing funding we have if we were able to get it up there. All right, so just to kind of quickly summarize what the total needs are, we broke it down again into these three components: the pavements, essential components, and bridges. You can see what the needs I show for 2018, which was 101 billion. And then in 2020, with the new cost data that we got, it's now $118 billion. Funding, however, did go up because we've got SB1 factored in. And you can see, again, for the pavement, essential components, and bridges, it adds up to about $55 billion. So the shortfall is about 64. So not perfect news. There's some good news and bad news in here. And the bad news, unfortunately, is that we just don't have enough to completely bridge the gap. So just some key kind of takeaways from this, if nothing else. One, I think, did SB1 help? Yes, it did. It helped arrest the historical deterioration. It helped slow things down, but it's probably not going to fix everything. I do have some caveats in here. First is that the PCIs that are reported to us are lagging. In other words, whatever you and your staff reported to us back in spring of 2020 could be data from 2019, and the full impacts of SB1 may not be reflected in there yet. Also remember that 2018 was a pretty conservative year because that was the year that the repeal was in place. And as you all know, many agencies either were conservative and held back on some of those expenditures because they weren't sure if they could commit, if the money was going to be taken away. So some folks were cautious and just slowed down their build. So I think what we need to see is that in 2021 and 2022, a full cycle of 2020, we had the pandemic, which was another factor. So it's premature, I think, for us to really decide or judge, what the full impacts of SB1 could be. I think it could be better than what I'm presenting to you, but I'm not sure until we get next year's results in. The other key takeaway in this, and I don't want to forget about the local bridges, is that they really are aging. This is a very important part of the infrastructure. and the funding has been flat. We really need to pay some attention to what we can do on these bridges. Lastly, of course, the construction costs, as I said, went up sharply. In many ways, the question is why. I think it's probably an unintended consequence of SB1. If you think about what happened is, the state got $5 billion of new money almost immediately. $1.5 billion was for the agencies. The other $3.5 was primarily to Caltrans. But the contracting capacity, the paving capacity was not there to meet this extra $5 billion. And just as things were getting started in 2017, we had the repeal in 2018. So contractors were not willing, I think, to invest in expanding capacity until they knew that repeal would fail. That didn't happen until November of 2018. And then in 2019, that's when things started going, but it still took time to build up to that capacity. And then in 2020, we had COVID, and that kind of stopped some agencies as well in their abilities to fund projects. So we've had a couple of headwinds, but I think what that impact was is that of the agencies that did have money and were willing to go out, we didn't have the commensurate supply from the contractors. And so we saw this increase in cost. We think that over the next 2 years, things should stabilize. The market will correct itself. We may see some either costs go down as more contractors come to the market or expand the capacity, or at least a stable consolidation of construction prices. End result of this is, yes, SB1 helped, not quite completely, results not fully known, but we're still predicting a shortfall over the next 10 years of about $64 billion. So that's pretty much the main points of the report. And as I mentioned before, it is available. It's on the website now. If you want to download it, just go to www.savecaliforniastreets.org. All the old reports in there, as well as the new reports. And we will have the maps. It's a story map, as well as the web maps up shortly in the next 30 days, as well as the bridge report. And if there's any questions, we have our contact information on the slide, myself, Chris, as well as Damon, if you have any questions about the study whatsoever. So I'm going to stop this right now and open it up for the Q&A.
Thank you, Margot. That was a great presentation. A lot of good information there. Have some great questions in the Q&A already, and I know we've discussed some of these internally already. So the first one I want to go to, because I think it does get at the underlying point of what were the impacts of SB1, what did we predict would happen, and what was evident in our 2020 report. So Scott Mosier asked, what are you seeing as the net effect for pavements in looking at increased SB1 funding versus scope of projects, complete streets elements, et cetera? And so that is something we discussed pretty extensively. So Margo, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. I think, Scott, I think, we've seen these increased costs, but what I will also say is that a lot of agencies in the first 2 years of SB1 focus on what I would call simple paving projects. In other words, they didn't divert a lot of money to complete streets. They just repaved roads that needed repaving, fairly straightforward paving projects. What is the long-term impacts as these pavements improve, and then is more attention going to go to complete street? I think the answer is yes, but I don't have a one answer for you as far as what that net dollar impact would be.
Yeah, and I think the other observation we've made is we had a pretty robust assumption in 2018 that basically almost all the new funding was going to go to pavement, rehabilitation, and maintenance projects. But what we've seen is, local priorities include active transportation. We saw a lot of ADA upgrades, especially in that first year of project lists. So, I think there is a balance between what are the community priorities and how does that play into kind of the long-term pavement management aspect. Let's go to, let's go to Cheryl's question next. So maybe Damon, you can take a shot at this. Can you share what impact the federal infrastructure bill will have for California?
Sure. Well, again, conversations are still ongoing with the federal infrastructural and transportation proposal, and we just learned that Congress has at least reached some sort of timetable agreement to advance that proposal. But we have up until September 27th, I think, is the internal deadline for which Congress has imposed, or at least the House has imposed upon themselves. Between now and then, there most likely will be some sort of iterations, but for California, it will be a significant impact. I know just from what the U.S. Senate passed, we see anywhere from $110 billion for roads. There's 69 billion for rail and 40 billion for transit. Again, this is nationwide and not California specific. And again, we'll have to continue our lobbying efforts in order to capture a lion's share of what our state needs in order to maintain and bolster our infrastructural investments here in the state.
Yeah, and I think I will add on, there's another question in the chat related to this. How can we use the report to advocate for local bridge funding at the federal level? So this is something that was a really significant provision included in the Senate passed bill. There's both formulaic bridge funding. We've seen estimates of several $100 million a year, close to $1 billion a year, potentially headed to California for bridge repair and replacement, as well as a nationwide competitive program. And so we're very excited about that opportunity. As folks know, in MAP 21, sort of the dedicated bridge program went away. It was folded into basically the National Highway Performance Program and the Surface Transportation Block Grant. And so while California maintained basically a set aside for local agency bridges, we've been stuck at that funding level since 2009, essentially. And so with those additional federal resources potentially on the table, I think it's going to be incumbent on cities and counties to educate our decision makers about these needs. And the report is a great tool for that. And to be talking not just to the state legislature, but also your regional agencies, because the way California has done implementation of the federal bill, it becomes a discussion between the state, between the regions, between the local agencies. And so really, I think right now, step one is getting that awareness as the bill is headed towards apparent passage, and then to really engage with your state legislative delegation, your city council board of supervisors, and then your RTPA or your MPO about how are we going to make sure that local bridges get a share of that funding that becomes available. And of course, we will have much more on that topic as CSAC, and I'm sure the League of Cities will as well, to help guide those advocacy efforts.
And Chris, just to put a finer point and try to answer that previous question as far as California's perspective or potential benefit, or at least our share of what was passed by the Senate. Of the 110 billion, I'm looking now at my notes now, California is anticipating 29.5 billion for highway and bridge repair and construction, and 9.5 billion for public transportation, 384 million to build out the state's EV charging network. And so that kind of puts a little bit more of a detailed, finer point on that. But again, these are ongoing negotiations, and subsequent iterations could modify and change those numbers.
Thanks, Damon. We've got a couple questions in the chat about sort of long-term revenue projections. And it's a little bit, I think the short answer is it was a little bit beyond the scope of our study. But Margot, would you like to provide any comment, any work done to evaluate the impact of electric vehicles on SB1 funds, and thoughts about how we might address that in the future? And I'll put in the Q&A for one of these a link to a really helpful study that looks at some of this stuff.
Yeah, I think we recognize that both electric vehicles and hybrids are going to have a reduced gas consumption. And we have not explicitly included that in our analysis because it's been hard to predict what that impact is. In my mind, I think COVID actually may change some things in the sense that people who used to take the bus to work or the train may be, leading towards private vehicles or carpools instead. And how is that going to impact? I think it's a little bit premature to tell. But I don't think the long-term trend is that it should reduce gas consumption. I think that's true. I just don't know what that number will be. Although I think there are some pre-COVID, there were some estimates that Caltrans had made on gas consumption. And I think, Chris, you said you can send a link out?
Yeah, I'm going to put a link in the chat to a policy paper from CSU San Jose that really sought to answer this question. And they came up with different scenarios about what future revenues will look like for transportation in California at various levels of zero emission vehicle adoption. And I think while the gas tax is the majority of SB1 funding, I think it's important for us to remember that for the first time really in California, the vehicle, it's called the transportation improvement fee in SB1, but about 30% of the revenue from SB1 in the first year, or rather at the beginning of the bill, is coming from taxes on vehicles that are based on the value of the vehicle. That tax rate has a built-in inflator. Also, the value of vehicles will increase over time due to inflation. And so there are some, while the trend is likely to be negative on the fuel tax side, SB1 took a step towards, well, what does the future of transportation funding look like? And so this research by CSU San Jose really sought to come up with some kind of bookends on what are the potential revenue scenarios. And so some of the findings are a little bit counterintuitive. So I'll put that in the chat, but it's something we definitely need to do more work and analysis on in the future. We see a couple of questions in the chat, kind of storm damage, climate change, some of the other things that we need to address on the local streets and roads system. And so again, this is something that wasn't explicitly included in the scope of the study, but Margot, do you have any comments about that general topic?
Yeah, we have a catch-all category that we just call other in under the essential components. And we were hoping to capture under the emergency FEMA related fires, storm drains, other expenditures that people needed to spend their gas tax money or the transportation money on. And that is for right now the best that we have. We don't explicitly have something for storm drain damage. We do have something for storm drains and storm water quality, NPDES type issues, but not storm related damage stuff.
Got one question that I can answer briefly. A discussion about how the gas tax is distributed. It's a topic that it's always difficult for associations that are statewide to wade into those formula fights. I think the more important thing for us to all be focused on as cities and counties as we go into the future is we've relied on these traditional formulas that have shared gas tax between the state, between local agencies. As I mentioned, SB1 was the first time we really saw a vehicle tax go to road maintenance purposes in a significant way. And so I think as we look at, well, fuel tax revenues decrease, what does a replacement look like? The TIF from SB1 also can support transit operations. So I think we're going to be having a bigger picture discussion for whatever the future funding stream looks like about how do we prioritize highways versus roads versus transit versus active transportation and those other modes. So we within CSAC have policy about what formulas we support for divvying up money between counties, but I do think something for all of us to be aware of is that future conversation. Someone mentioned here, don't forget about our road charge task force. That's a good point. There's good materials there on their website. And there's also a legislative effort this year to sort of extend the work of the road charge task force and look at future replacements for the fuel tax. How is California handling electric vehicle sharing and the cost of street maintenance? There are more companies utilizing e-trucks. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, the EV space is is growing and becoming more innovative. There are multiple modems of DC fast charging and inductive charging and solar charging. All of those spaces are growing. Local authorities throughout the state are starting to embrace much of those kind of evolving technologies and expanding on their capacity of being able to charge for zero emission vehicles throughout their jurisdictions. I think the state's efforts is to help increase and see an increased utilization of that. I think some of our advocacy efforts are surrounded around ensuring that we maintain stable revenue sources for transportational infrastructural needs and ensuring that those various buckets are maintained properly and aren't exhausted prematurely.
The next one here is a pretty simple one. What's the timeline for the release of the next report? As Margot mentioned, we do this on a 2-year cycle. So the plan is to go out with the survey for the update for 2022 early next year, so early 2022, and release the report later in the year. Our time frame got a little extended this year. We extended the survey because it was out while the initial days of the pandemic were happening, and then had some difficulties getting all the pieces together, but we're going to try to get back onto our more normal schedule. And so before the end of 2022, we'll hope to finalize our updated report, but you'll be getting the survey as local agencies early next year. Another question about ZEV. So SB1 does include a DMV registration fee that applies only to zero emissions vehicles. And that's in addition to the transportation improvement fee that applies to all vehicles. Question from Charles Herbertson about bus weights as local agencies move to electric buses, which are heavier. Will we see legislation again to raise the maximum weight limit? Damon, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful to be able to predict what legislation gets introduced prior to each session, but I suspect there will be undoubtedly bills that are introduced in this space to respond to that issue.
Yeah, the one we saw this year was related to milk trucks, so that didn't move forward, but typically CSAC's policy is usually we oppose those. We have general policy statement about balancing the needs of maintaining the network, and but especially when it's related to air quality and climate change, those are difficult trade-offs.
And just to remind those on the call that the last 2 years have we've experienced at least last year a truncated legislative session. And both this year and last year, the legislature has imposed some limitations on the bills that have been introduced by each member of each house. And so those respective offices have to pick their priority bills. So what we saw this year was a tsunami of nearly about 2,400 bills introduced. And then members were having to voluntarily pick their favorites and then mandated to do so by leadership later in the year to just 12 bills per office. We don't know what next year will look like as far as House protocols and what, if any, limitations are imposed by members and what they will be introducing and have to prioritize.
Thanks. This is a good question for Margot. Are there any things that local agencies can do to improve the quality of data that's submitted to the survey? So curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Number one, don't wait till the last minute to submit your survey numbers, because we usually get a huge influx of requests that this didn't work, my link didn't work, I can't find my password, or what does this mean? And so we're struggling trying to handle all of your requests at the last 2 weeks. Please start earlier if you can. The second is probably in terms of getting good data is on your roads. Keep your pavement management systems updated regularly. And then all you have to do is just go to your software, hit a button, it'll click and give us the data that we need. But your job is just to have your staff go out, survey the roads regularly, hire a consultant to do it regularly, and keep that information up to date. It's extraordinarily useful for us. The second part, I think, is on the essential components. This has been all of you have been adding more and more information, and we're getting better and better data. But I think we have some improvements that we could make. The storm drain, I've always been a little concerned about that. It's all guesstimates and what those values are. If you have some way of inventorying what your network is and what your needs are, similar to what you're doing for your roads, that would go a long way. And then I think finally, the last part is your funding estimates. This is the part that we need your directors of finance or your controller to help out. Most of the engineers who are responding to the survey don't have a good handle, I think, on what the total funding availability is. And we just need some good data on what kind of money you're getting from, what sources, how is it being spent? If you're not spending it on roads, what are the categories you're spending it on? Very, very helpful for us to kind of parse through that.
Try to take a couple more questions. I see a quick one about local match for highway bridge projects. I will point out, again, it's difficult because it's the prioritization issue, but SB1 includes explicit authorization to use those funds as match for federal resources for eligible projects. So that would be eligible. But we do understand, especially in rural agencies, that the local match can be an issue. And I think that's something that's important to bring up with the Highway Bridge Program Committee. We've got city and county representatives on that, so would encourage you to reach out to them. There's a question about the workforce development provisions. I don't have a great answer on that. I know there was some studies. There was a few $1 million allocated to the California Workforce Development Agency for pre-apprenticeship programs, really to get folks into the various different apprenticeship programs to be able to work on these projects in the future. I'll pull up the link to their website. I don't have a good summary of what the outcomes of that can be, but it's maybe something we can discuss at future CSAC meetings.
And I'll just kind of add on to that, Chris, is much of the CTE investment, which is about $300 million, split between the community colleges and the high schools, predominantly for classes for juniors and seniors. They are split up amongst about 8 different consortiums around the state on a grant funding cycle and vetting process. And while their state's got some augmentations to those, we have to be at least cognizant of the workforce development programs in construction, and specifically the various trades that are in this space only represent about 3% of all the workforce development programs out there. And it takes through those apprenticeship programs anywhere, depending on the discipline, 3 to 5 years to successfully complete the program, get that certification, and be able to go in as an apprentice and then a journeyman in whatever discipline they're following. So right now in construction, there is a 5-to-1 ratio for every 5 construction workers that are retiring. There's only 1 coming out of the apprenticeship programs to backfill them. So that skilled labor gap is widening and getting worse. And so there is a tremendous need for the state to invest in these workforce development programs in order to ensure that these workforce gaps are filled in order to meet the transportation and infrastructural needs.
Thanks, Damon. So I'll answer one last question before we wrap up. I know we're now over time. Projected SB1 revenue losses due to COVID lockdowns and restrictions. So we've done some initial work on that at CSAC. We can include it as we do our end of year wrap up on what the revenues have been. I think a couple mitigating factors. Number one, the fuel tax rate increases still happened. And then we are starting to see VMT recover at the state level. So, and if you look at a couple of the revenue streams, we're still up year over year. It's just we're not as up as we would have been once you spread it out over that year. But I don't have a pithy response, but it's something that we can help summarize. And it's certainly something we'll be discussing in the 2022 update, because that you're correct. It was a really significant and quick reduction. But with that, Damon, any closing comments? Again, thanks, Margot, for the presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and just quickly to thank Margot, Chris, thank you for emceeing, and also our sponsors, as well as our oversight committee members, the website to access this report and some of the supporting documents, the executive summary, and some of the fact sheets is at the savecaliforniastreets.org website. And over in the bottom right corner, we see Chris, Margot, and my email addresses. We welcome any input and additional questions that you may have that may not have been addressed during this webinar. But again, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.